Why do we overproject ourselves? I'm not sure about you, but it's often the main source of stress in my life, predicting I can do more than popping a bollock when I can't. Scholars like Wilson and Gilbert argue it's due to errors in affective forecasting, or impact bias, where people base many decisions on how they think they'll feel in future events, particularly if they can assume it gives them everlasting happiness. But in reality, our reactions are often short-lived, therefore we often don't maximize our own happiness. And what's really fun about the Spider-Man Home trilogy is that it goes back to the heart of the character, which deals with this very predicament, where it's about a kid obsessing with his future and underestimating how emotionally resilient he is. Oh, by the way, I missed this. I'm going to use the monomyth again. I've got the words beautiful in the title. I'm examining the self. Good times.
What? No, of course I'm not a male escort.
Before I begin, I've got to bluntly say, I fucking love MCU Spider-Man. Andy G is still my true love, but as a dude whose favorite Spider-Man stuff goes straight back to the Lee Ditko run, the Home trilogy are wonderful homages that get Spider-Man right in a way that Sam Raimi, Mark Webb, and even Axel Braun didn't, which is that Peter Parker in high school is not a soap opera about attractive people getting mad at each other. That's Romita era. It's about a trickster irritated by the idiots around him. Oh, I've had it. I'm through pretending to be a panty waist to conceal my real identity. I don't need those specs anyway. Steve Ditko strongly believed Peter was a character who belonged in high school, to the extent that it's one of the reasons why he left the book.
I know when I talked with him, again, a lot had to do with what he felt was the essence of Peter Parker, that this was a high school character, that once you graduated him from high school, it was just no longer a character that could make mistakes. So it was time for him to leave and go on and do other things.
Regardless, this publication era is easily my favorite because they wonderfully capture the vibe of being 15 years old, stuck at school with people you didn't choose to be friends with but are forced to because you can't not grow up with them. Spider-Man Homecoming is effectively, at its core, a loving tribute to this style. There's a particular moment where Peter Parker is in detention and he's fucking fed up and just leaves. That's perfect Peter Parker, a kid who's like, fuck this with his school. And the film dramatizes his behavior by contextualizing it in a simple story with a very simple question. What do I want from my future? Peter Parker, as a horny little boy, is very attracted to Liz, sexually. He wants to be recognized by his idol, and he wants to escape from the peons around him. All these wants are Peter Parker's misforecast for what he believes is necessary for him to be qualified as a grown-up, even though they're all kind of childish and immature. And the source of Peter Parker's inaccurate affective forecast stems from the unexpected high he got from Civil War. Academic research across a variety of fields has shown that such impact bias trigger 4 processes. First, attention. For example, a student who unexpectedly receives an A on an important exam will initially think about little else. Second, reaction. They'll feel overjoyed. Third, explanation. And finally, fourth, adaptation. The event will come to be seen as more normal and inevitable than it actually was, and hence, it will lose some of the emotional power that it had when it still seemed extraordinary. For Peter Parker, he makes sense of the events when he loses everything one by one and must survive by emotionally letting go of his forecast, return to reality, and work on himself. The arc also introduces the formula for Peter Parker's psychology, where his hyperbolic reactions to change is the very source of his poor affective forecasts. Consequently, as the first act of the trilogy, Peter Parker metaphorically left home for the new frontier when he rejects Tony's offer, crossing of the first threshold. This decision sparks a divergence between Peter Parker and Spider-Man, where their desires no longer run parallel to each other. So by No Way Home, Peter Parker dies and Spider-Man lives. But before then, he's gotta answer a different question. What is it that makes Peter happy?
Bright flashing by the street lights. Keep waiting till you.
If Homecoming was about what Peter Parker wanted from Spider-Man's future, then Far From Home is about what Peter Parker wants from his own. And what better way to symbolize this than on a holiday? The story is centered on illusions. The notion that Peter Parker does not see himself through his own 2 eyes, because for him to advance forward, he must overcome his self-doubt. Peter loves MJ because of the way she looks at him. Tony left Peter Edith, which represents the new eyes he must look at himself and imagine his future with. However, Peter doesn't believe he's deserving of inheriting such recognition, because as much as he's got a more mature idea of himself, he still has an immature idea of Tony, who's not a person but more of a concept, the spotless, clean idol who's defined by an illusory, abstract unreachability, which I just immediately loved. It's so classic Peter Parker, creating a problem that wouldn't have existed if he just simply believed in himself, right down to him giving up his responsibility, not because he's deliberately being selfish, but he's overthinking what's considered altruistic. Psychologically, Far From Home is about the pleasure of uncertainty about positive events. If making sense of positive events reduces the duration of the pleasure they cause, then inhibiting the sense-making process should prolong people's pleasure. The lessons Peter Parker learned from Homecoming becomes his chains in Far From Home, because when he rejected his future with the Avengers, he found happiness with the world he had lived. But now that Tony's dead, he's thrown into an unknown space where the only way for him to preserve his happiness is to avoid making sense of his new future. Both MJ and Mysterio allows Peter to feel safe in his assumptions. He assumed MJ loved him due to all her attention, as opposed to her being suspicious. He allowed Beck to steal his own future because he's unable to see himself with the same exclusivity he gave Tony. Therefore, it takes Happy Hogan to reveal all this to be bullshit to break his chains. He knew firsthand Tony was a mess, who's far from perfect, and this truth rids Peter Parker of his fear of being inadequate. The Iron Man he kept seeing everywhere was an illusion of his self. Consequently, you wouldn't think it, but Peter Parker's arc in Far From Home is what his entire transformation in this trilogy is planted on, for the reason that it features the Atonement with the Father stage, where Peter finally confronts what held power over his life. And that's his self-destructive practice of believing he can't be himself to reach his future.
I just wanted to be like you.
And I wanted you to be better.
So, just like the Black Dahlia, he realizes he doesn't need to be perfect to be deserving of love.
Sorry it's broken.
I actually like it better broken.
I really love Far From Home, because it's so fucking chill. Every Spider-Man film treats New York, the symbology of the costume, the love story with operatic sacredness, but if you read the old Lee Ditko stuff, there's none of this sense of grand self-importance. Peter and JJ would just go to Florida to get the scoop on the lizard, and the whole issue is basically a kid stuck with his angry boss. Peter's costume would just get torn and he would just buy a new one from a shop, although it did shrink when it got wet. And the whole love triangle between Liz, Peter and Betty Brant is often used for humorous misunderstandings. So I fucking adore this film for having the same irreverence. Peter's just trying to enjoy Europe as goofy problems keep interfering with him. The love triangle is played for laughs. The costume is casually destroyed. Therefore, even more than Homecoming, it feels peak Lee Ditko, where everything has a sense of humor and it isn't bogged down by a need to appear constantly grand. I know it's a lot of people's least favorite, but f it, I'm not gonna lie. No Way Home finishes all the combinations with what does Spider-Man want from Peter's future, which also represents the crossing of the return threshold stage, where the hero comes home as a different person but struggles to keep their newfounded wisdom. MCU Peter has grown into such a different dude that he's defined by a completely different set of variables. Instead of being too impulsive, he deals with self-doubt. He wanted the popular girl, but is now in love with an outsider, and from wanting to abandon his school life, he's excited for university. However, like Homecoming, we're back to a story about a kid losing his desired prospects, but it's flipped. This time, it's Peter's future that's threatened, which is deeply ironic. First, he was disappointed he couldn't fully live as a superhero, then he wanted to escape from it, and now it's displacing his personal life regardless. Therefore, as expected, with this anxious Peter Parker who can't imagine a future anymore, he has an impulsive, hyperbolic reaction that causes more problems. A multiverse crisis. As the film stated, he could have contacted the university, or even get Strange to erase everyone's memory of Mysterio. There's numerous solutions, but he didn't pick them because the point is, this is the last teenage Peter Parker story. His last mistake, which can only be fixed with him learning to live with the price of his decisions, which extends as the central theme for everything. For Peter Parker to follow his responsibility, he loses May. For the villains to live, they must relinquish their powers. To save his friend's future, he must lose them. A lot of people consider No Way Home a form of course correction, which I can kinda see. If you're a fucking normie. I mean, it forecloses with the tone, cast, and style from the previous films. But this reset is completely consistent with how Peter's graduation should be told. Unlike the Raimi trilogy, which blurred Peter Parker's teen and adult life together with the same cast and tone, Stanley explicitly soft rebooted his own run when high school was over. Peter's entire teen supporting cast, Liz, Flash, and Betty, were all written out. The tone switched from being a goofy sitcom to a romantic drama. And in university, it's where Harry and Gwen comes in. I've always loved this reset because it's so accurate with real life. Learning to choose your friends in uni was one of the most important lessons that changed my life for me. Furthermore, the Iron Kid stuff, which everyone argued over, had served its purpose. Spider-Man becoming the next Iron Man was never f***ing gonna happen cause A, there's no way in this bull-cockamania world would Disney let the mascot of their multi-billion-dollar collection of franchises be a property owned by another company. They're gonna constantly be in a weak-ass position at every renegotiation. And B, narratively, Iron Kid was never a destination, but a form of pilgrimage. Rejecting the Avengers, ceasing to fetishize Tony's memory, and now losing Happy and all his other benefits from Tony is the logical conclusion that's been carefully managed for 5 films now. MCU Peter Parker's personal arc was always about a kid learning to be able to wear the glasses of his role models, not inheriting or being defined by them. Therefore, as he pays his price in No Way Home, those new eyes must be used, so you can see and make the right choice. Which is symbolized by Doctor Strange, a colleague who treats Peter Parker as his equal but is disappointed by his indecisiveness, but by the end admires his sacrifice and his clarity of vision. Furthermore, it also would have been very easy to make all the other Spider-Men, Andrew Garfield, Tobey Maguire, and Xander Corvus, be inspirational mentors, but they're actually more like mirrors. In Homecoming, when Peter Parker started shouting, to survive, just like in If This Be My Destiny, he's recognizing that there's a possibility locked inside him that's independent of his wanted connections. And now, Spider-Man, as his self-created personal standard, quite literally comes to lift him up. They're men who's lived and are living through the uncertainty that our Peter Parker is trying to see through, to the extent that they literally help Tom make sense of May's death. As a result, poetically, they materialize the increasing divergence between Peter Parker and Spider-Man's futures. The kid, who started on his journey just texting Tony every day wanting attention, has grown into a man willing to forfeit any recognition, becoming the very better man that Tony saw. And just as issue 28 closed Peter's time in high school with the loss of love and steps into a new, lonelier world, MCU Spider-Man makes this into an ultimatum to complete the story. Then, as the sun begins to set and the crowd thins out, Peter Parker takes a last walk past the school which houses so many memories. But as with all of life, it isn't really an ending, but a beginning. The beginning of a new chapter in the life of the world's most amazing teenager, of those whom fate has tossed into his web of destiny. Trilogy shows us that our biggest enemies aren't ourselves or even others, but the idea we have of ourselves and the expectations that we then imprison our own futures with. Affective forecasts have the capacity to directly inhibit our ability to fully maximize our happiness. In all 3 films, Peter lets go of a vision of his future, ones that he always got to live for a moment, to be responsible to himself, to achieve new freedoms, to write his own future unrestricted from purely the pleasures of his own success, but to also integrate his own mistakes, make a lesson from them. His strength came from closing the space between his eyes and his ideas. In Homecoming, Peter learned to discover himself by accepting the disappointment of others. In Far From Home, he learned to see himself through the illusions casted from his self-doubt, and in No Way Home, he learned to continue living. Collectively, we see a kid letting go more and more of himself until the man inside is fully unearthed. Stories helps us to see the world, because it gives us context for what we've experienced and what we haven't. Obviously, most of us haven't had to deal with interdimensional dangers or superpowered heists, but to be obsessed and trapped by an unrealistic wish, I know I did when I left school and entered my 20s. And capturing that feeling so harmoniously is why I think this trilogy is beautiful.
Suddenly, the world I used to know, I see it differently. You woke me from a dream, now here's reality. Baby, baby, you are really hurting me. 'Cause every time you tell me I look good in bed, I'm doing fine, but nothing ever changed.
So yeah, this was the Affective Forecasting Spider-Man essay I mentioned a while back. I know I under-discussed MJ and the whole love story, because I'm going to split her side off into her own video. Also, No Way Home is going to get its own singular essay once it's out on home media, because I really want to do a whole narrative analysis on it. By the way, also check out my mate Alex's sketchbook, who recently did a really cool animated trailer for what Spider-Man Home 3 could have looked like if it didn't do the multiverse stuff. I'm also in it, so obviously I'm completely impartial. Anyways, special thanks to my patrons, I love you all, and you guys are deciding what's next.
And now I see, baby, you are hurting me. Stuck in repeat. Stop lying.
Please, Scooby-Doo this crap.